In session 2, we're going to, this will be on assessing scalability. There's a supplemental materials within your folder about assessing availability. Those documents might be referred to during this session. Before I introduce the first speaker, again, just to mention that material, this is some documents that Larry Cooley assembled for us related to this topic of assessing scalability, and the authors of those were willing to let us provide those to you for, they may be referred to, as I said. Let me introduce now the lead speaker for this session 2. Richard Cole is the lead consultant and vice president for scaling strategy with his consulting company, Strategy and Scaling LLC. Richard, let me ask you to join us on stage. Following this, we'll have a panel discussion on this topic. Richard.
So it's great to be here. Some of you may think this has been a conspiracy, but I just want to acknowledge that many of the things I'm going to say today are the result, particularly of over almost 20 years of a partnership working closely with Larry Cooley, where Larry and I think, invented the first scalability assessment in about 2005, and have been iterating on that ever since. Work that I did with a team with Johannes Lin at IFAD, and a lot of the lessons we learned from IFAD, and I know Paul Winters will talk about more of the IFAD approach to scaling, and ongoing collaboration in particular with the wonderful team at USAID. I won't be able to name all of them, but starting with Julie Howard, who I think deservedly got recognition last night as really being the driving force behind integrating scaling into Feed the Future, and then Mark Heisinger, Laura Schrag, and other people who are constituting the USA team on scaling. The first thing I want to start with is I would like to suggest that for the rest of this conference, as Larry mentioned in his presentation this morning, that when we talk about scaling, we're going to be talking about scaling in terms of not simply achieving large numbers, but also sustainability. And actually, I'd like to add a couple of things to that, which is to include impact and equity. I know that sounds odd. Well, the equity doesn't sound odd. But I cannot tell you how many times over the last 15 years I've been involved in scaling projects where things go to scale without impact. They're widely adopted, but they're adopted imperfectly or without fidelity or with lack of supporting systems, and therefore the impact is significantly decreased, if not almost eliminated. And I can give you some examples of that offline. So it's really important that we talk about scaling with impact. And as Larry hinted, and I think this is going to be one of the major themes for my presentation this morning, is that scaling is often about trade-offs. And in fact, one of the most common trade-offs is the trade-off between scale and impact, but that's not what I'm going to talk about. The second thing I want to say, just as some preliminary remarks, is that there are many types of scaling, and I too, like Larry, will primarily be focusing on scaling up technology innovations in agriculture in developing countries. But we can achieve large-scale impact through other things, such as was mentioned last night in both speeches, in terms of system strengthening and other things like that. And in fact, as you'll see in my presentation this morning, almost invariably, scaling up an innovation requires some strengthening of the systems. And Larry talked about that quite nicely in terms of planning for scale, whether it's mobilizing political support or others. And again, you'll be hearing from him later, but if you haven't read the articles by Johannes Lin on creating space for scaling up, or spaces and drivers, that's a good place to start in terms of thinking about how do we make sure that there are systems in place, or as part of a scaling strategy include strengthening whether it's market systems or the public sector enabling environment. Most of the things I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to refer to a scalability assessment tool that I and Larry and MSI helped develop for USAID's Feed the Future program to assess the scalability of agricultural innovations. The USAID tool, which you have at least some of the summaries of in your supplemental materials, is also available online, but it's not the only scalability tool out there. And I really want to give a plug for some really important work that some of the panelists you'll be seeing in a few minutes have been doing. Leonard Weltering and a team at CIMMYT have been working on a scalability assessment that's a bit broader and does include scaling up projects and other types of scaling up. And Paul Winters, who's at EFAD, EFAD has integrated scaling into their project design and qualitative assessment review process of project designs, and they have a set of questions and some guidance on how to do that, and those are also both valuable tools that I'd suggest for those of you who are interested, you might want to take a look at. So I was raised in the tell them what you're going to say it, and tell them what you said. So if you get nothing from my talk, these are, I think, the key points here. First of all, I really want to emphasize that scaling is context-specific. This is especially important for those of you in the audience who are agricultural researchers, because when we're assessing scalability, the intrinsic characteristics of the innovation or the technology only can really be assessed in terms of their scalability when you look at, well, where are you going to scale this or to whom? And if we think about that, there are really four aspects of that. One is obviously the characteristics of the innovation itself, but in particular, how do we compare that to what, let's assume that this is an innovation that would be adopted by farmers, which isn't always the case, to what farmers are already doing. Because if you take nothing else away from my talk, the biggest question about how difficult or easy will be scaling up will be, and English actually is my first language, is the degree of change that the potential adopters have to undertake in order to adopt the innovation. So most innovations, if they're things like seeds or animal breeds or other things, often require or come with good agricultural practices. If you have to change the agricultural practices, then that's a heavier lift. And that's why this issue of complexity has already come up several times. Similarly, if you have to change market systems or market institutions or the policy enabling environment. So again, if you go back to the graph that Larry, was one of his last slides, had of what the intermediary actions are that a scaling strategy should do, all of those things, the bigger that change are, it will have to be, whether it's in regulations, in behavior, or market institutions, the more difficult it is to scale. And so most scaling strategies, or most scaling assessments, I should say, do not usually come up with a thumbs up or a thumbs down. This is one that you should scale, or this is an innovation you shouldn't scale. What they tend to come up with is, here are major challenges. This will require a very large change in farmers' behavior, or this will require filling in gaps in a value chain. But on the other hand, it could have this kind of impact on this many people in terms of nutrition, productivity, yield, perhaps gender empowerment. And so for whoever is making the decision about should we invest in further research or scaling this up is going to have to weigh those pluses and minuses, as opposed to saying, oh, we use our scalability assessment, out pops a number, if it's above this threshold, we're going to fund it. It just doesn't work that way. Or at least it doesn't work that way in most cases. As Larry said, for every PICS bag case where it's usually a slam dunk, there are 99 cases where there's pluses and minuses. And I think really the goal that we should be doing in assessing scalability is revealing clearly what would be involved in terms of time, level of effort, institutional change, strengthening extension services, changing farmers' behavior to have scaling actually occur and be successful. So the trade-offs, I think, are the biggest thing. Okay? Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to be talking particularly about the scaling tool that we developed for USAID. We named it the ASAT, the Agricultural Scalability Assessment Tool. And as you can see from the slide, over the last 5 or 6 years, under the first set of Feed the Future funding, USAID invested over $1 billion in funding agricultural research, and many of you here have benefited from that, whether you're with a CGIAR institution or an innovation lab, and that's been wonderful. The challenge now for USAID is that a lot of that is coming online. It's moved through the various phases of the research process, And of the wonderful things that many of you have developed, unfortunately, we don't have the resources to scale all of it. So how does USAID make informed decisions about what to scale, what to reinvest in, et cetera? And as I mentioned before, this framework that we developed draws on work that Larry and I started doing over 10 years ago, almost 15 years ago, the diffusion of innovation literature, and also a number of case studies that we did for USAID's Bureau of Food Security on successful scaling up, and I can share that material with you. A lot of the references are in your handbook or will be found, no doubt, in the source book. Okay? So the one point that I want to make, though, is that even though this was principally designed for the point there in which it's, should we invest in scaling? In other words, we've hopefully either going to do a pilot or have done a pilot, and should we go from there to issuing an RFP, having a design, et cetera? But actually, scaling can be integrated, and this picks up on Larry's point, from the very beginning. One of the questions we want to ask is the research process generating the kind of evidence that we need to make a good assessment of scalability and decide whether to reinvest? And I'm going to come back to that point in a few minutes. But a scalability assessment can be used at all of these stages. Once the basic research is done, you can assess what do we need to do now, not only to do proof of concept, but to do proof of effectiveness, and particularly proof of scalability on the ground. Should we invest in a pilot to generate more evidence? And once we go to scale, or at least initiate a scaling project, how do we know whether we're on track? So in a sense, a scalability assessment can be used as a tracking mechanism in all these different stages for both deciding what are the strengths and weaknesses, designing a scaling strategy, and then monitoring how that strategy is doing and whether it needs to be changed. We have in the audience with us for this, participants for the next few days, a team from IDE, and I had the pleasure of working with them in Bangladesh for a few years on a scaling agricultural machinery project. And one of the wonderful things about that, of the many wonderful things about that project, and there was also a case study of scaling of that on deck, is that the team put in place a scaling-informed monitoring and evaluation system that allowed them almost monthly to make changes in strategy. And I really want to emphasize that a scalability assessment tool is a living document and not simply a one-off, like thumbs up, thumbs down, and it's go or no-go, because part of the idea is to use it to not only potentially inform a scaling strategy, but also to potentially modify the innovation itself. And that is something that researchers need to be involved in, since they usually designed it. And so even when you move through these stages of a scaling pilot or full scaling, having them on board is critical to participate in that. All right? Oops. OK. So there are basically a few categories of key scaling information that we need. And as you can see, this kind of mirrors some of the things that were discussed in the previous panel. Who's going to supply this innovation or produce it? As Dieudonné and others said, getting PICS bags produced was a major challenge. Okay? If there's no production, no matter how wonderful this is, scaling is going to be impossible. Who's going to distribute it? How are we going to create demand? One of the most difficult challenges in scaling, and it was sort of implicit in the conversation this morning, was that a scaling project usually has to both stimulate demand and create supply, but has to keep those two in rough balance, because obviously producers are not going to want to produce stuff that no one's going to buy, and people are not going to want to buy stuff if there's nowhere to buy it. Okay? And I think one of the things you can see implicit through this is the question of incentives. This is not a technocratic solution. It's a question of why would someone want to produce this? Can they make money? Why would someone want to distribute it? Can they make money? Why would someone want to adopt it? Can they make money? And so if you look at the criteria that we've developed and integrated into the ASAT, there are basically 8 baskets. One is what kind of scale and impact can it reach? Secondly, is this addressing the needs of the adopters? And particularly for adopters, there's the question of benefits, risk, and affordability. And I really want to highlight this question because it was brought up in both talks last night. Okay? Rob Bertram mentioned that one of the great things that of the many great things that Feed the Future has done is that it both has supported both resilience and increases in productivity, yields, et cetera. And I don't think those two are unrelated. For most farmers, those two things, the risk is actually often more important. They don't just want to know how much is this going to increase the productivity of what I'm doing, but is it risky? Especially if it requires a new investment, adopting new technology, putting more money on the table, et cetera. So these criteria are particularly important. And as you can see from most of them, almost all of them have to do with context. You can't measure affordability unless you know what the purchasing power of the farmers are. You can't measure the risk unless you know where they're growing them or under what conditions. You can't measure the strength of the market system upstream or downstream unless you know what country or what location or what region you're scaling in. So this all requires that. And as I said to begin with, as you review these criteria, what you'll find is that any individual innovation has strengths and weaknesses, and those gaps and weaknesses are basically what's going to both help you assess scalability, but also decide what's required if you're going to put together a scaling strategy. I just want to highlight one last thing before I stop, which is that, particularly for those of you who are researchers, one of the things we found in assessing scalability is that often research projects don't produce the information we need to effectively assess scalability. And to give just a couple of examples, one is on robustness. Okay, yes, it produced these amazing results at a research station run by the National Research Institute with PhD agronomists growing it, but they did it perfectly. What happens if you don't do it perfectly? We've seen empirically that most farmers do not adopt all the parts of a package. They may adopt 3 of the 5 needed good agricultural practices or 2 of the new inputs, but not all of them. Are they going to get 50% of the increase in yield? Or what happens if there's how is this sensitive to weather? How is this sensitive to other things? What's even the normal variance, even if you do it right? Because if you're taking out financing for this, are you going to be able to pay back your loan? So one of the things that I really want to encourage the researchers among you to do is to produce the information that we need for scalability. So this is a list, and I'm not going to read it, of the kind of information we need, but you can see it's quite extensive, and I hope in the future we can integrate in Innovation Labs, CGIARs, and others this kind of information so that we can make a better attempt at assessing scalability and then using those assessments to devise scaling strategies. So in conclusion, I think the key points here are that assessing scalability is about identifying what's needed and making decisions based on those trade-offs, using it at every stage of the process, as Larry said, not just wait until we're all the way at the end, and particularly having a team that has the information about the context, where we're going to scale, what farmers are doing, how strong or weak the market system is, and the public sector enabling environment is, so we can make an informed decision. So thank you very much.
Richard, thank you very much. I wanted to assure you all the slides from the presentations, various presentations will be made available on the website, so that will help you later on. As I ask the panelists and the moderator to come to stage, let me just mention a couple things. I know it's difficult for the moderator to see who's maybe in line for questions, so I'm going to ask the students to be of help with that and kind of keep track of which order to take the questions in. That should help you out, Paul, as moderator. Let me introduce our moderator, and then he will introduce the panelists. Paul Winters is with the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD. He's Associate Vice President of the Strategy and Knowledge Department and also Director of Research and Impact Assessment Division. He's going to help us follow up with discussing assessing scalability from the perspective of USAID, CGIAR, and a company. Paul.
Thank you. So first, just to note for all of you that if you look in your packets, you do have this supplemental material that has some of the examples of how you do assessment of scalability, so you can look at that. And I just wanted to highlight one thing that Richard said about EFAD and generally what he was saying about the importance of impact and equity. And this is one of my big concerns about the discussions we've had so far. We need to make sure that we're scaling up results, not just a technology, but a result that we want. and that requires that you're going to have impact. And for an organization like EFAD that focuses on smallholders, it requires that you're focusing on equity as well. With that, let me introduce the panel to my right to left here. Julie Howard is the non-resident senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and former chief scientist for the Bureau for Food Security at USAID. And I found out she was the first chief scientist, so Rob followed on after her. Leonard Waltering is the scaling advisor. We'll ask him about what that actually means later. At the International Maize and Wheat Research Center, CIMMYT, in Mexico. And then we have Mark Edge at the end, the Director of Collaborations for Developing Countries at Bayer. Because we're going to be focusing on different groups and their different assessment tools, we'll do one set of questions for each speaker on the panel, and then we'll go to the audience. So let me start with Julie, and I'm going to start with two questions for you. When the focus on scale was launched at USAID's Bureau for Food Security, you played a central role, that including initiating the work that Richard was just describing. So the first question, why did you see that as a priority, and what were you hoping to accomplish? Then following on that, now that it's 5 years later, how do you feel about the progress, and what do you see as the biggest challenges in institutionalizing a systematic approach to scalability assessment?
Great. Thanks so much, Paul. Well, before I start answering your questions, I wanted to reveal what I hope will become the official flag for this conference, which is, of course, a PICS bag. And this PICS bag is special. It was manufactured in Nigeria. I found it on a trip to Kaduna last week. And what's special about it for me is that I was not looking for this PICS bag. So I happened upon the PICS bag. So I think PICS bags are now well on the way to becoming ubiquitous, which I think that really is what scaling is. So congratulations. But, like so many promising technologies, as we've been hearing over the past couple of days, the PICS bags almost died on the shelf. They were developed in 1987, as we heard from Dieudonné, from a USAID investment through the Bean and Cowpea Crisp here at Purdue. And then they lapsed, right, until a few years ago, when the Gates Foundation picked them up and said, this is something really, really viable. Charlene McCoyne, I think, played a very central role in that. So then she dusted them off, set them on the road to scaling with partners like Purdue, like AGRA, like SG2000, and of course the local private sector. Well, as Rob Bertram was telling us last night, the donor community, including USAID, we always make investments in research and technology with the intention of developing the next green revolution variety, the next PICS bag, but mostly the transition from research on shelf to real-world changing technology has not been planned for, and that's what we're here to talk about this week. Well, in 2012, then USAID Administrator Raj Shah challenged the CGIAR leaders to, in fact, go beyond research to ensure that critical ag technologies, well beyond the PICS, get adopted at scale. So he challenged them, and this was, it seems like a no-brainer, but it was shocking and somehow kind of abrasive at that time for the CG Center directors and the boards of the chairs of the board to hear this directly from Raj Shah, that this is part of your mission. It's not only research, it's making sure these things get adopted. And so we actually got quite a bit of pushback at that stage from the host of CG centers who said, we are researchers. We're not seed developers, we're not seed technologists, we're not marketers. So it was a little bit of a struggle, but important. We thought so that the promise of these technologies, to change millions of lives could be changed. So let me talk a little bit about why. Of course, the moral imperative. We spent all this money. There are these wonderful technologies. They're not being adopted. But we also had in front of us with Feed the Future, a presidential level initiative. Never thought I'd see that in my lifetime. But we set ourselves some big goals. 20% reductions in poverty and stunting, as you heard from Rob. And we realized, we're not going to get there unless we do a better job at getting technologies out. So we had this sort of pressure, this train coming down the track of the big goals for Feed the Future. So these were sort of the driving forces, and it's actually now 7 years later, not 5 years later. What's been the progress, and what are the challenges? Well, I think there's been quite a lot of progress on a couple of different levels. First, I think scaling, as Larry was saying, scaling is not something that you whisper to a few friends. Scaling is something that people are talking about. And at USAID, scaling in ag and nutrition has become a policy and a politically driven priority for USAID and Feed the Future. During the US presidency of the G8 in 2012, we also promoted scaling with our global partners. So we launched the new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition, which had taking innovation to scale as a major theme. And among other investments, USAID put a major investment with AGRA. I think Joe DeBreeze is going to talk about that, on scaling seeds. So another and potentially even more important area of progress is, I think, the work in the trenches that we were able to do over the last 7 years with our USAID missions to really sort of get to the down and dirty of what does it take to scale technologies. And this is very insightful and very hard work carried out by my colleagues, starting with Andy Levin, but also Mark Heisinger, Laura Schrag, and Richard Cole, Larry Cooley, and others. And so here we have the administrator breathing down our back. Here we have us breathing down the necks of the USAID missions. Have to scale. And they're saying, well, how? Andy Levin, I remember, comes to me and says, okay, Julie, I have been looking through Google. I've been looking for all the literature. There's very little on scaling agricultural technologies. There's Ev Rogers from the 50s, and there's Johannes Lin, right? So Johannes Lin became our best friend in going out to us with workshops with the missions, really trying to help us work through, well, how do you assess your portfolio? What does it really take to scale what you have? So we realized how very little practical guidance, how very little written stuff was available to help missions, and we started sending out SWAT teams led by Richard and Mark Heisinger and Laura and others to really sit down and work with the missions and say, what do you have? What technologies are you working with? What are your complementary programs? And how do you start piecing these together? So really, I think, pivotal work and the need that Mark and Laura and others found we need some written stuff on board. So case studies, successful agricultural technologies that have gone to scale. So now there's a book on this. Now there's a study of that, including the Bangladesh study that Richard talked about. And then working with the missions, we said, okay, you guys, come up to us with an assessment of your portfolio. And the mission said, quite rightly, how do we do that? So, and some of the missions were very creative. So some of them came up with very, very elaborate and very good cost-benefit analyses. And as an agricultural economist, I did my dissertation around the cost-benefit analysis. I loved it, but it was wholly impractical, really, for all missions to undertake cost-benefit analysis of every promising technology. So really needed another kind of tool for them that captured the key elements of the cost-benefit analysis, but also some of the environment, the drivers, the other assets about the other characteristics of scaling that we've been talking about. So that was kind of the genesis of the scaling assessment tool that Richard talked about. So I think USAID, I cannot claim credit for this because I just started the ball rolling, and really colleagues at USAID and Johannes and Larry and Richard really have taken this forward with Mark and Laura. So that's where we are. The biggest challenge in 30 seconds. The biggest challenge, I think, for me, from this remove, is not further perfecting the accessibility tool. It is really changing the institutional culture of funding agencies that still makes it so very difficult to do scaling. When we went out and talked to missions in the initial workshops about the glimmer of hope, the scaling that they were able to do, we too often found that the folks who were able to scale, they were doing it because they were coloring outside of the lines. You know, they were somehow bending the rules of USAID contracts to work with this partner over here. It wasn't strictly in their mandate. It's too difficult, yeah? So it's almost like scaling is in spite of the framework that we create to work together. So how do we fix that? That's what I see as the biggest challenge.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm glad to see that EFAD is not facing these kind of challenges alone, because these are the exact challenges that we face as well. Okay, let's turn to Leonard. First, let me ask you a bit more about your role as a scaling advisor within CIMMYT, and how this work relates to CIMMYT's broader mission and structure. So if you can explain what a scaling advisor actually does.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So CIMMYT is one of the CJR institutes that you were talking about. And we are indeed mandated to alleviate poverty and hunger among the maize and wheat farming systems. And when I joined there 1.5 years ago, I realized that, well, there are actually a lot of projects going on. This whole focus on research, it's still there, it's still in the culture, but there's a lot of basically what you would even call development going on. And when they said, okay, now you're a scaling advisor, you have to help us with scaling, I said, okay, I've been an advisor before, I would like to know what actually scaling means within that context of CIMMYT. So I did a big tour around many projects in many regions. And in one place you see, okay, Leonard, now we have to reach 1.5 million farmers within 6 years or 3 years, and we only have this much amount of money, right? So this very push for numbers. You go to another region, they say, well, we don't like that approach so much because we can do that, but this is at the expense of sustainability. Another region you go, you say, well, we assume or we interpret scaling much more as a system change, so we want to work at a very different level to really change basically the root causes that are there. So when I came back from that trip, I said, well, maybe scaling for an organization that works on poverty and hunger, like huge problems, that also has a research mandate, is probably a combination of those three. Reaching those numbers, the sustainability, but also the system change that is really necessary. So my role is basically there to support this transition from, let's say, a technology push culture, I totally agree with you guys there, to a much more systemic change mindset. So, for example, in a few months we have a workshop organized on system change and transition science, etc. And what this also led to, these lessons from these regions, is to have a bit of a framework of what scaling is and use that to improve proposals, but also implementation of projects. And at the same time, this helps for cross-regional learning, because you recognize things as part of a scaling strategy or that are part of scaling that they would do, but not really maybe necessarily recognized as such. And this again helps for cross-program and regional learning, and also helps to flag issues at institutional level.
Okay, so I believe you have a couple slides. So my next couple questions, hopefully they'll put the slides up now, please. If you could tell us a bit about operationalizing this, and you have the scaling assessment framework that you've been working on, how it compares to others, and among the ingredients in your scaling scan, which ones have you seen to be the most difficult to achieve and why? So they have the first slide up.
All right, so I'll just assume it's behind me. Thanks. So yes, it is, huh? Okay. So the scaling scan was developed together with the PPP lab. The logo is there. It's basically SNV in the Netherlands. And it was really done to have this meaningful discussion about scaling, because the interpretation varies so much, even within one institute, and let alone the project partners that you're dealing with, right? So what actually is scaling? What does it mean in our context, for our project or for our initiative? What does it take to really do the scaling? And what could be unintended consequences of going there? What if you go really for this maximum scale? Wouldn't it be more important to go to the optimal scale, where you might have less trade-offs, right? So this was really developed to have that discussion with the kind of people, stakeholders, etc., in a simple way, as simple as possible. And it really revolves around these 10 ingredients, as you can see. And these ingredients represent, well, basically from the lessons learned from looking at many projects, what is actually necessary to scale. And all these 10 ingredients should be at a mature state. Some are already there, you don't need to do anything with it. You don't even have to look at it. You can say, no, it was a policy problem. Or you say, no, it was a problem of finance. But in the end, if you look at it really holistically, all those 10 things needed to be in place at some time to really reach that scale, right? So I think from that CIMIT background, that technology push, a lot of focus has been on one element only, the technology and the practice. This will solve it, right? And this really helps people to force them to think beyond that and say, it's only 1 out of the 10? God, I did my PhD, my bachelor and a master and PhD on this. So you really force them. What are really the lessons learned in collaboration? What is true collaboration and how does that feed into scaling? So put that really attention on that one.
So which of these has been the most challenging to try to push?
Well, I would say 2 answers. First answer, finance. I think out of the 9 reports that you read, not only from CIMIT but everywhere, it says great innovation, but we have to figure this out how to get it financed. I think it's in basically all the final reports of probably everybody sitting here. And I think there's an urgent need for improving the financial literacy of farmers, service providers, but also of us. What do we know about the cost of really scaling? What does it really cost? I think we are really at a very basic level there. I talked to somebody yesterday who works on finances that actually I was told not to talk too much jargon in this group because people will not understand. And she's totally right. We don't know what the world of finance enough. Finance is one thing, but if you zoom out, and if you look at all the 10 ingredients, I think what you can see in the kind of things that we do good, developing the technology, understanding demand, build capacity, and monitor if beneficiaries are adopting what we're doing. That's what we can do in this project context. But if you go to the next slide, please. Yes, these are the ones with the lightnings. These are the ones that actually, after the pilot or at the end of the pilot, suddenly get attention. And we're like, oh God, how do you actually transfer from this project finance to market finance? What is a real business case if you take out the project context, that in reality, right? How do you really collaborate? Who is actually going to lead the scaling effort once this project is over? These are like stressful things at the last months of the project. And I think like Larry said, this should be part and parcel of the project from the beginning. So this is really a consequence of how we design projects. I think we pilot, what we call pilot, we pilot maybe the innovation. We don't pilot the ways of collaboration. We don't pilot the ways of making that transition from project to market finance. I think all these elements should have been piloted within the project, and not only if that technology works, yes or no.
Since we're short on time,
sorry.
You're okay if we move on? Or?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So let's move to Mark. So how does Bayer assess the scalability of proposed technologies and innovations, and what's your role and your team's role in this process?
Thank you for that question. I think it's highlighting to me this meeting how the public and the private sector have so much in common in goals, but so much different in how we approach things. For me, when we talk about scaling, I don't get to have any meetings at Bayer where we don't start with what's the market potential and what's the scale possibility of this. So we start with that in mind, and many of the things that Larry mentioned earlier in his presentation and others have been saying about how you go through these steps and everything, that's actually intrinsic in our corporate institutional DNA of how we approach things. Actually, I find sometimes that the challenge is that limits us from what we can do because we instantly get to, oh, well, that's not scalable or there's no market for that. So we have these different approaches, but commonality in what we're trying to do. I would say that it does start with strategy and vision about what it is you're trying to accomplish, and really understanding what your core strengths are. We don't try to figure out how we're going to scale something with financing because we're not a finance company. We have to figure out who else we're going to bring in to do that. So you have to focus on what are your core strengths and say, this is what we are going to focus on and this is what we're going to do. The other part of it is that as a corporation, we become very product focused. We don't make money, we don't get our salaries paid unless we sell something. So it's very pragmatic as far as the approach that you need to take and say, well, if it isn't going to sell, if it isn't going to add value, it's not going to be something that is going to pay the bills, and therefore it's a good idea for somebody else, but not for us. when we get into trying to define what it is that we're going to bring to the marketplace, there's a couple of things. First, you have to look at the product and say, what is the compelling product value that's bringing to this? So is there a compelling product value? Then there's the question of, is there broad access? Can you get it to a broad, is it possible to get it to a broad market? And then there's another aspect that we look at is whether there's a market-driven opportunity there. So then when we look at those things from a high level and say, okay, this looks like something that we would like to pursue, the next step is really to do a lot of market research, what we call market research. You can just rephrase that and say, gather as much information as possible about what is going on out in that marketplace and what is going to be the potential to actually sell that product. So market information is extremely important. So we do surveys, we do all sorts of different approaches to try to evaluate what it is the end customer is going to actually ask for and how compelling is that product going to be. So will they come back and buy it, and will they tell their neighbors that they should buy this product as well? As we go through that, though, it's not just I came from the marketing group, but it's not just the marketing guys that do this. We have to really talk about it cross-functionally across many different things, because the 10 elements that you talked about here that are part of it, we have to understand all of those dynamics. So that means you're going to be talking to the researchers to understand what does the research community think, what are the technical aspects of this that we have to consider. We have to look at the regulatory piece of this. What are the regulatory opportunities? What are the barriers? What are the impediments? We're going to end up talking with our corporate engagement crowd, with the industry affairs and government affairs. Quite honestly, when we get to developing countries, one of the biggest pieces is what is the policy environment? What is the political will? And you can have everything else in place, but if the guys that are working with the policies come back and say, you know, this is a non-starter in this country because this one guy or these three guys or people in the government are going to block it, you have to cut your losses and say, well, okay, what are we going to do about that? So that cross-functional approach is something that's really built into how we approach deciding what goes to the market, and that all is asking that question, fundamentally, what's the scalability? So my role in that is I work as the director of collaborations for developing countries, and my role is really that cross-functional approach to find where are those collaborations that we can do, and how do we get all of that information. And when we look at developing countries in particular, that's where it's very, very clear that there's a big gap in information, and there's a big challenge from a policy and a political will standpoint that we cannot do it alone. We absolutely need collaborations, and we need all of you in the room that are working together on this to try and make those things happen. So that's sort of what I try to bring to the equation in that process, but understand within the corporate organization how I have to sell it internally for folks to be able to say, yes, we want to actually sign up and do that.
Okay, I'll turn to the audience, but let me ask you one more question. How good is Bayer's track record in picking winners for scaling up? So you've described the process. Do you do a good job at doing that? Is it trial and error? How does it work out?
Well, there's certainly an element of trial and error in everything that you do, but I would say that we are actually quite successful at this. But what you see on the public facing of things that when it gets to that we're going to make a product launch. For example, I used to be the cotton product manager and lead cotton introduction, so Bolgard cotton, for example, in India. That launched in and it made a huge impact in India. Got taken up, and it was clear that that had compelling value and all of those things. So we have lots of experiences of very good success. But I think that what doesn't get seen outside of the corporation is all of the failures that there are before it gets to that stage. There's a whole pipeline of products that we have, and we're all constantly evaluating those. And from the very beginning, we go through 4 stages of development before it even gets handed over to the marketing side. So stage 1, stage 2, it's proof of concept, all of these sorts of things, and the whole corporation understands that process of pipeline development and bringing it to the marketplace. So we probably have more failures than we have successes for sure, but by the time it gets to the point where the marketing guys and the sales guys are going to actually put this into the marketplace, usually there's a consensus around, no, there's a really strong opportunity, and we've lined up the financing internally, we've lined up all of our stakeholders, all of that whole process to be able to get it to say, now we're going to make a successful introduction of this technology into the marketplace. So we have a really good track record, I would say, when you start to say, we're going to introduce it into the marketplace, and that's actually attested by actually our sales growth and what we do. So yeah, it's a mixed bag, but we're experienced at it, I would say.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. So we have about 15 minutes, I think, for questions. So why don't we turn it to the audience? As noted, we'll let the people managing the mics pick who has questions. Please, there's a gentleman in the middle here. Then in the back. Is there someone who, yeah, there's a woman in the back as well. Please.
Hello.
It's
Yes.
on.
Thank you.
Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Andrew Koroma. I am in the Brian Lamb School of Communication in my final year PhD, and I have developed a passion over many, many years in looking at an aspect of scalability, which most of the conferences that I've attended right from school days up to university, that's like 10, 15 years ago, up to today, much is not mentioned about that aspect of agriculture that we need to pay attention to. And I was hoping to see in these ingredients that we had a little element of that. But looking at specifically the knowledge and skills component, which should be further investigated, is the fact that the communities that you have all worked with across the world have developed, or they have had children that have, or youths that have gone to school all the way up to university and have had different qualifications in agriculture with the intention that they will go back to work on their parents' farms. And I happen to be one of those examples. Now, over the many, many years, over the several decades, I think a critical question that we need to raise and to answer and probably research a little deeper is, why aren't these young folks who have gone to university and they have learned about this technology, everything that we've talked here about, our faculties are teaching these courses, or at least they are giving them the fundamentals that will help them succeed in helping to scale up agriculture. The only thing that has changed over the years are the individuals. The scientists have changed, the institutions have evolved, but that aspect of adoption has not changed. And if you look at the finance that has gone into this aspect over the years, it runs into billions and billions of dollars.
Okay.
So I'm saying simply is, we need, as part of scalability, we now need to look at new areas, like she said at some point, that looking for new tools. Okay. And the last speaker said that we've had more failures than successes. My case is, do we need a component that will address specifically how do we get our young graduates in agriculture to constitute a part of this scalability program by enhancing their entrepreneurial capabilities to fill that gap?
Okay, thanks. So this question came up in the last session as well, and it's been a big issue. When I joined EFAD 3 years ago, this was something that was talked about endlessly, about youth and young people and the need to make agriculture sexy, for lack of better words. So in thinking of scalability, do you have to factor this in? Do you have to factor in that there's a dynamic change that's going on, there's expectations that are changing among young people about how agriculture will be? So how do you factor that in? So why don't we start with Julie?
I think that's a great point. I also think, the new generation of upcoming agriculturalists and nutritionists are a great thing, because this is a group of young people who are used to using technology. They are intrinsically interested in new technology, all kinds of new technology, not just IT. So it's an incredible opportunity, of reaching a group with new ideas and new thoughts and helping them, helping them fulfill their potential as entrepreneurs in this space.
Okay, Leonard, do you want to add?
Yeah, I think what you said, I think making agriculture sexy, it's probably more making agriculture profitable. I think that will attract...
That's sexy.
That's sexy, yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's what I like about IFAD. Yeah, so I think that is really the important thing. But you're right, I mean, the youth, that's a big issue. And I think also when we go to scale, we should also make sure what actually happens to the youth. If we can only reach scale by focusing on the rich and the established farmers, what happens to the others, right? So that's something we need to really consider from the onset.
And Mark, from the private sector's
Yeah, so
perspective?
the private sector is constantly looking for talent and developing talent. And I think that what we really need is a business environment that's going to create this entrepreneurial spirit. It shouldn't all be big companies. We need lots of small companies getting started up, developing that talent and creating those opportunities. I think sometimes there's too much focus on the educational degree and not so much on the pragmatic make it happen. And we really are looking for people that have that right attitude about making a difference and getting in and rolling up your sleeves and making a difference is what really matters. And so, I just feel like what Africa is at a stage of this huge opportunity that's in front of it, but we need to figure out how to unlock it, and most of it comes down to policies that make it difficult to start up businesses and maintain businesses that really needs to be unlocked in Africa.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to the back over here, I believe.
I can't
We're
hear.
having a little trouble hearing.
It's not on.
Is the microphone on? Maybe we could switch the
Or maybe
microphone?
move forward. Maybe there's like a zone, a dead zone.
Thanks.
Sorry about that.
Ah,
There we
Perfect.
go. My name is Alexandra Spieldock, and I'm with Compatible Technology International. We're based out of St. Paul, Minnesota, and we specialize in post-harvest processing technology solutions for smallholder farmers in Africa. And so really pleased to be at this conference, and thank you to Purdue. I love the PICS model. I love the development of the local supply chain actors throughout Africa. I think it's a really strong model, and it's one that we have been prioritizing as well in our programs in West Africa and in Southern Africa. However, one of the challenges we've found, particularly with processing tools, is that uniformity is really important. And so there's a lot of rhetoric around training local artisans, et cetera, but then not enough attention, in my view, toward quality assurance, which the private sector understands really well, and I think we miss the boat on that often. Another issue is when we try to identify manufacturers in Africa, this issue of how many orders, large versus small, comes into play in terms of their willingness to work with us and to be real partners. And then third, I think the private sector understands very well, and by the way, we came out of General Mills, food scientists started us there, and we have the food companies on our board, but the private sector understands very well how important it is when you're starting in a new market, an emerging market, to really invest the financial capital to get to do that, to introduce, to create demand, et cetera, et cetera. And we found it challenging. I mean, the development community, there are the various multi-year projects that are funded. There's talk about the equity coming from the private sector, et cetera. I'd like to I'd like to harness, I'd like to see whether we can collaborate more directly with some of the food companies like Bayer, like Cargill, like General Mills, who may not see a profit model, but see value in the kind of work that many of us are doing here to be able to provide expertise and financial support, collaboration, and partnership to get to that scaling point, because never a better time than for the public and private sector to be working more closely together as partners. Thank you.
Thanks. On this issue of the private and public sector working together, I mean, do you include that in your assessment? Are you thinking in terms of how you have a pilot, you're going to move up? How does the combination of the two work together? well, why don't we start over with at the end? I know you already mentioned a bit about this, Mark.
Yes, so
Please.
public-private partnerships are very important and potential for us. I think that the challenge is always finding the mutual benefit for each partner in it. I'm a big stickler on there has to be a reason for every partner to participate, that they're going to gain something out of it so that you can get the institutional organization to buy in. A good example that we've participated in is the Water Efficient Maize for Africa project, which is a partnership with actually CIMMYT, 6 NARS, and funded by the Gates Foundation and USAID. That project has been going on for 10 years, and now we're into the 11th year of that and at a scaling up stage. So there's certainly examples that we have that is like building on our core strengths of what we do, and helping to catalyze change and development in the seed industry, for example, in Africa. Food industries, a whole nother can of worms, a whole bunch of challenges there. We're not necessarily a food company, but we have a lot of interaction with those, and I'm certainly looking for, as we develop value chains, to connect with those food companies that are buyers of product, because what we really need is actually the pull from the farmers as well, that they have a market to sell into. So there's huge opportunities from a standpoint of sourcing good quality food in Africa that's aflatoxins free, all sorts of challenges in that area, and I see many, many opportunities for those sorts of collaborations to help happen, but it takes a lot of time to put them together in a way that is going to be that every partner really is doing it, not just for corporate social responsibility, but for really market-driven reasons and reasons that are in line with the organization's basic reason for being. So those make it very difficult to put those things together, but I think that when you get those elements there, it actually can work very well.
Okay, Leonard?
Yeah, so CIMMYT is also working very intensively the last couple of years with, for example, with Kellogg's and Bimbo and Walmart, etc. And they're not approaching us because they say, okay, you have great technologies. They say, you have shown over the years that you also know how to reach smallholder farmers and how to get things done with them. So in that sense, we don't work as a technology provider, but we're helping, for example, with the monitoring and the tracking of the products, etc. So it's a bit of a different role, but it's super important because it really is the reality, the real world going on there. And rather than having these projects to project to project, this is the real market that is going on there. So we learn a lot from that, and I think that's what we agree on here, right?
Please, Julie.
Yeah, so Mark said something important earlier. So about when a corporation goes through the scale or not scale, it's like an on-off switch, right? So, but many of the opportunities I think that we work with are in that space. Well, it could be on if, right?
Yeah.
So, but precisely what I was saying before, it's difficult, right? Funding agencies have the opportunity and have the means to help that switch go from off to on. But as Richard and others have said, it's very context specific. So it may need extension agents, it may need policy change, it may need blah, 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 right? So that kind of flexible, that kind of adaptive, that kind of really gearing it to local context is something I think that public funding agencies can do well. Yeah. But as I said, it's difficult right now. It's almost, if it happens, it's in spite of the current restrictions that go on, right? So I think that public-private collaboration is at the core of most scaling efforts, most successful scaling efforts that we know about. It's too hard. We need many more. I would love to see, I hesitate to call it a lab, but a scaling lab effort, that really sort of spins off really innovative, radical collaborations of multiple funding agencies, with multiple private sector, with host country governments at all stages, to see here's an innovative technology. Let's suspend our thinking about here's the way we have to get things done and give ourselves some freedom, right? Suspend a little bit, not accountability, but the way we normally do things, to see what would happen if we gave the scalability assessment tools a fair shake and got the information that Richard talked about all along the way to help us make informed choices and also to adjust the path as we need to.
Okay, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to go to the very last question, and you only have time for a tweet and nothing else, so 30 seconds. So where do you think efforts to sharpen scalability assessment tools should go next? So what's your tweet on the where we can sharpen scalability assessment tools next. So you want to go ahead and start, Julie?
Institutional culture change so that scaling is no longer accidental.
Perfect.
So you want to scale the scaling tools, right? Okay. So I think it's not about tweaking them, it's really about having them how to use them. Are people aware that they are around? Is it there an advantage for people to use it? Are institutions asking their people to use it, etc.?
Perfect. Mark?
Good usable information that you can trust, that you're going to be making decisions without there's such a lack of transparency in so much of Africa that we end up deferring to, well, we don't know, so therefore we won't decide. Good data is really the fundamental to be able to understand a market and make a decision.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for being brief. So thanks. Let's thank our panel.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we could have gone on and on with that, but you see a wealth of resources here to meet with throughout the rest of the conference. Shortly, we're going to move into breakout groups associated with session 2. Before we leave, let me explain how the breakout groups are going to work throughout the conference. Between sessions 2 now and 6, 4 different times, we're going to break out and have either 4 or 5 options for you. The rooms for those options are listed within your conference booklet, and those breakout rooms are always back up on second floor of Stewart Center, near where you had breakfast this morning. Outside the door, there'll always be a sign that says which topic is being discussed at what time. There will always be, we'll repeat those breakout sessions twice with 5 minutes in between, so you can move from one room to another one. So you'll be able to participate in 2 of the either 4 or 5 options that are listed there for you. There's short abstracts of those options given within the program booklet, the section that's called Program Details. Within each breakout group, there's going to be a leader or multiple leaders of that breakout group, and they're asked to give a 5 or 7 minute opening talk, and then it'll be followed by a period of question and answer discussion. I'm going to ask that for those, and as we do panels in the future, if everyone could hold either their comments or their question that they're going to ask to just 1 minute. And we appreciate, as you've been doing, is always introducing yourself and giving your affiliation for that. In session 2, the breakout groups, those are each going to be 25 minutes, and they're primarily case studies. 3 of them are case studies. The 4th one is an option with the breakout group about USAID's tools for assessing scalability. Now, in your conference booklet, in the printed version, it gives an option that I'm afraid is not available. Lois Miraguri with GalvMed unfortunately had to cancel at the last minute, and so that breakout group that was to be in room 204 is not an option, but the other 4 options are indeed there. In the website, that's been corrected. So online, the conference booklet is correct, but the printed version it still includes Lois. Lois, we're sorry. We will still include her abstract, her information, and slides that she provided. She unfortunately was not able to join us. Now, in preparation, I'm going to ask the case study leaders and our USDA guests to come forward to give a snapshot. They're each going to give a 1 minute elevator pitch about their case study option. One representative from each of the groups is going to come to do that, give you a sneak preview, and we'll ask you to come right up on stage and do that. You'll introduce yourself.
Good morning. My name is Parastu Hamed, and I will be looking at taking on-farm storage to scale in Kenya. I'm from the Ag Results Initiative, which focuses on incentivizing the private sector through a pay-for-results project to bring them in and to take devices and technologies to smallholder farmers. We use this to be able to bring them in, but also focus on taking these devices, making them profitable, and actually being able to target smallholder farmers so that not only these devices are created, but that they're actually making it all the way down to the smallholders through distribution networks, marketing, and sales. Thank you.
So Mark Huizinga and I, Mark from USAID, will be leading a session on the tool that I described earlier, the Agricultural Scalability Assessment tool that we developed together for USAID. If I can tease you a bit, one of the things I forgot to say in my talk, but I think we can definitely talk about, is that one of the big challenges we found in applying it, as we've been trying to integrate it into USAID's decision making, is that there are many innovations out there that for whom a private sector business case is weak or non-existent for one or more actors. And this is particularly the case for public goods. And so how do we assess the scalability case for public goods or cases or innovations where the social benefits are significantly greater than the private benefits or can't be captured by private actors? So we'll let you decide what we talk about, but that is certainly one of the things we'd very much like to discuss with you. The supplement is in your handouts, but the matrix that we're using is almost 50 criteria, so it is a bit complicated, and we'd be happy to talk about why we went that way. And we also have a decision tree about sorting out whether a public sector scaling case or a private sector scaling case makes more sense. So hope to see you there.
Good morning. My name is Joe DeVries, and I'm the Vice President for Program Development and Innovations at AGRA. More relevant to this setting, I'm also the former director for 10 years of the Program for Africa's Seed Systems, which was a program piloted at the Rockefeller Foundation when I was there and taken to scale at AGRA. We took the view that having studied green revolutions from around the world, improved, high-yielding, locally adapted seed was a sine qua non for a green revolution in Africa as well. And that you could pave the roads, you could bring irrigation, you could even supply fertilizer, but if you didn't have quality seed, we weren't going to go far. And so we started out with the view that to take seed to scale in Africa, based on a study of the history of the intervention there, governments and even NGOs had largely failed to be scaling the supply, the dependable, regular supply of seed, and we would have to go private. And for us, private sector meant real private profit-seeking African seed companies and also agro-dealers. We also started with the premise that there was real genius to be tapped into within Africa's national agricultural research systems, plant breeders who understood both the science of developing better genetics for farmers and also understood the local context. And we believe that if we push those two forces together, public breeding and science and private sector delivery capacity, we would achieve some kind of magic. And third, finally, we knew the farmers were ready, that the idea that farmers weren't interested in increasing their yields and intensifying their farms was in fact a myth, and it was we who had been failing them. So we'll be talking about what went right, and also spend a few seconds on what went wrong. And I believe we're going to be in room 202. Hope to see you there.
Good morning. I'm Tim Pruitt. I'm the CEO of International Development Enterprise, and our breakout session will include a case study Richard mentioned on scaling up agro machinery in Bangladesh, and I'm here with Connor Riggs. On a personal note, I'm just delighted to be in Indiana. I've spoken in many states as part of IDE, but never in Indiana. So this is a very proud moment for my grandmother, who my family farms south of here. So it's great to be in the state of Indiana. And although most of my cousins, which include John Cougar Mellencamp, are massive IU fans, I come in peace. And I will keep my comments subdued. I also worked on PICS bags in Nigeria, so it's great to see that continue to go. Right, so the Bangladesh agro machinery case study, if you're interested in human-centered design, if you're and testing multiple technologies to get to where you need to go, if you're interested in risk sharing with the private sector, we had about 12 firms working on this case. If you're interested in feedback loops and adaptive management, we've documented that case and we've learned quite a bit from that. So I think we have a lot to share, and also pleased to share a bit about ID's other efforts to scale and our many efforts that failed over the years in agro. Thank you.
Would you help me thank all of these? And you're welcome to go on down. And you can go on up to your session if you want. Before everyone leaves now for the break group on second floor of Stewart Center, let me mention some details about lunch, which will follow immediately after the breakout sessions. After the second round of breakout sessions, you can go directly to the Purdue Memorial Union North Ballroom. There'll be students helping direct you to that. For the buffet lunch. Both today and tomorrow we'll have networking lunches. The persons sitting at with anyone with speaking roles within the conference they're asked to sit at one of the tables, and they're assigned tables. There will be 2 or 3 people sitting at each of the tables. You're invited to join them and get to know them during the lunch and have conversations. You can see it's a wealth of knowledge among our speakers. There's just a couple changes in the table assignments from those that are in the printed version. Again, online has been corrected because Lois Miraguri of GalfMed is not here, and Tim Krupnik from CIMMIT had to cancel. There's been a little bit of shifting, so we've shifted a couple people who were at 3 people tables to a 2-person table with the 2 speakers at each of the tables. The changes, as I said, are corrected in the electronic version, and right outside the Purdue Memorial Union North Ballroom, there will be signs, a couple of signs that you can look at to check the listings in case you're interested. During the lunch, we're going to have Simeon Yui from the World Bank as our guest speaker. We'll reconvene here in Loeb Playhouse at 1:30 for session 3 on markets and finance. So now let me ask you, you're welcome to move directly to second floor of Stewart Center to begin those breakout sessions. Help me thank everyone involved in session 2, please.